We owe much to the ancient Greeks, from the invention of democracy to citizens' participation in government to the Olympic Games. The Greeks laid the foundations of science and created Western drama. The Romans conquered and unified Europe. Their greatest achievements lay in administration, infrastructure, and above all, their system of law. The Vikings stormed onto the world stage as raiders from the sea, but they went on to build a vast network of trade, and they were the first to discover America. Between them, these three peoples were the founders of Europe. Once they were dreaded, but the achievements and discoveries of the Northmen helped shape modern Europe. The Vikings came from the far north of Europe, or what one Roman historian called the world's end. The Romans called this distant region Scandinavia. To outsiders, it was a mysterious place where nature ruled. It was not only distant, but almost empty, a place where ice met fire. There, the untamed forces of nature predominated. And no matter where you went, the sea was never far away. The Scandinavian coasts, comprising stretches of today's Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, were the homeland of the Vikings. When the Northmen set out in their longships, they terrorized much of Europe. One of their earliest raids came in the year 793, when the dragon ships descended upon England. Their objective? A monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, an important place of pilgrimage off Northumberland. On the island, the monks lived a life of work and prayer. These pious men were rich and peaceful. They defended their treasures with words, not weapons. To the Vikings, a god who had died on the cross must be weak. He must be a god who was unable to fight or protect his people. So the treasures of the monastery were there for the taking. The monastery lay close to the coast. Once the ships had reached the shore, the raiders would fall on their victims immediately, without warning and without quarter. That was the typical Viking strategy. Long-term plans were not for them. The men on the ships were fearless, seasoned fighters. This was not their first raid on England. The treasures of the English church drew them like a magnet. By the time the monks noticed the invaders, it was too late. With their attack on the Abbey of Lindisfarne, the Vikings opened a new chapter in world history.
No sooner had the monks seen the Viking ships on the horizon than the warriors would have been here standing at the monastery. For the monks, this would have been a traumatic experience. Many of them saw it as a sign of worse to come, and they were right. The raids continued until eventually the monks were forced to abandon the monastery.
So began an age of fear. The pagan strangers were huge men who knew neither fear nor mercy. The Vikings became notorious for their brutality. Worst of all were the berserkers, wild men who worked themselves into a frenzy of slaughter. The men of the cloth hadn't a chance against the onslaught from the sea. All they could do was pray. Most of the monks were killed on the spot. Any who survived were enslaved. The booty made the raiders powerful and famous in their homeland. They carried off as much as they could load aboard their ships. Behind them, they left death and destruction. The raid on Lindisfarne was only the beginning. From then on, the dragon ships attacked the English coast again and again. In the early Middle Ages, half of Europe lived in fear of the Vikings. They were the most successful warriors of their time, yet their personal equipment was nothing special. Hardly any of them had chain mail, nor were their weapons exceptional. Only a few of them had helmets, and none of the helmets had horns. That is a myth. Warriors in horned helmets first appeared in Wagner's operas. There has also been speculation about what drove the berserkers. Was it perhaps magic mushrooms? But they induce nausea, so probably not. Perhaps other plants played a role. They too could have acted as stimulants. A fungus found in grain is said to bring on hallucinations. The practice of shield biting could have been a form of self-hypnosis. But most authorities believe that the Vikings did not use drugs. Instead, they shouted themselves into a fighting mood. This released hormones that made them disregard pain.
Nowadays, we believe that it was their fighting spirit and not their weapons that made the Vikings such effective warriors. This was a time when most people were violent, but perhaps the Vikings, more than anyone else, really understood how violence worked. They even gave their swords names, celebrating it. Battle Blaze, Bloodthirster, Life Hater. These swords weren't better than others, but they were an integral part of their owners' lives, important possessions. We can compare this to those people today who give names to their boats or cars.
The Vikings' most important weapon was their ships. Their longships were not only the fastest craft of their time, but also the most stable. From the coasts of Scandinavia, the Vikings sailed to the Baltic, to England, the Rhineland, France, Spain, and Italy. They descended upon cultural and trading centers wherever there were coasts or navigable rivers. The dragon ships had room for raiding parties of several dozen men. Fara I Viking is what they call their expeditions in search of booty, going a Viking. In other words, going on raids overseas. But there was another, more peaceful side to the Vikings. They spent most of their time at home. as fishermen, farmers or craftsmen. The things they made in their villages were easily traded. Above all, tanned animal skins and furs. Some even fashioned runestones, but the majority lived from the bounty of the land, the sea, or the many lakes. Their smithies were famous. Many a piece of loot was melted down. Particularly precious coins were sometimes worked into jewellery. A typical Viking house was small and without windows. Much rarer were the big long houses where the clan chiefs and their families lived. At the beginning of the Viking era, the Northmen had neither a state nor a kingdom. They were organized in large family clans with a leader, the Jarl. The most powerful Jarls were a kind of lesser prince. Below the Jarls came the freemen. They were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen or merchants. Their wives were the mistress of the house. If in summer the men went raiding or trading, they ran the household alone. At the bottom were the landless, who worked as servants or maids. All the important decisions were made at an assembly of the free men of the district, the Thing. They met at an appointed time in the open air. There they made important decisions and discussed the law to resolve disputes.
Hört zu! Wir haben uns hier versammelt, um eine Entscheidung zu treffen. Eine Entscheidung, die für uns alle gut ist. Wir müssen einer Meinung sein. Wer etwas dazu sagen will, der soll jetzt reden.
In Iceland, the free men met at the foot of a volcanic chasm, which they regarded as a magical spot. There they held a general assembly, the Thing, an early version of Parliament. There were also trading towns like Birka, Kapang, and Haithabu in today's Schleswig-Holstein. They carried on international trade as early as the 10th century. Haithabu was a town of around 1,000 people. It was famous for hosting ships from many different countries. Merchants from all over Europe came to Haithabu to exchange their wares for jewellery and goods looted by the Vikings. A trader from the Orient praised Haithabu as a great town at the furthest end of the ocean. The Northmen's feasts were notorious. They liked to drink in large quantities and often. Getting drunk was a sign of manliness. At the great feasts held by princes, it was customary to have a skald, a poet, to sing the host's praises.
Was ist denn los? Wo bleibt deine Darbietung?
Unser Gast langweilt sich schon.
Ein Lied auf unseren Hausherrn und seinen weitgereisten Gast.
Er hat große Schlachten geschlagen.
Mit reicher Beute kehrt er heim und lässt uns alle Anteil haben. Lädt uns zu seinem Festmahl ein. Er kennt sich aus mit vielen Schriften und hat die Welt schon weit bereist. Doch er kann trinken wie kein anderer und hat die schönste Frau zur Seite.
So! Ihr seid so hoch wie unsere Dattelbäume. Eure Frauen sind so blond und leuchtend wie die Sonne. Und ihr
seid auf eine Art und Weise gastfreundlich, wie ich es auf meinen vielen Reisen noch nie erlebt habe.
The Skalds went from court to court reciting heroic legends and verses praising the prince who was hosting them. The works they recited were passed on by word of mouth and only written down from the 12th century on. The Icelandic sagas and the Edda poems told of the deeds of courageous men, of drinking parties and pirates' raids, of wandering the seas and wars. But they also told of the Vikings' gods, and there were a lot of them. The gods were not, however, the only figures that peopled the Viking imagination. The world of the Vikings was a world of secrets. It was an inexhaustible source of myths and magic. They believed that every crack in the ground, every geyser, was the home of a spirit. A giant could live in a volcano, or a dwarf tend a smithy. They believed that giants were involved even in the creation of the world. In the beginning, there was only fire and ice. When they met, it brought forth the ancestral father, Ymir. But the gods killed Ymir. They made the earth from his flesh and the seas from his blood, the mountains from his bones and the forests from his hair. His skull became the sky, his brain the clouds. The first man and woman were created from 2 tree trunks. The chief god, Odin, lived in Valhalla. A rainbow bridge connected his realm with the world of men. His son, Thor, made thunder and lightning with his hammer and guarded mankind. Whatever the problem, people turned to Thor for help. But when someone died, they sometimes sought the advice of a witch. Husbands and fathers were often killed on raids over the sea. Their families hoped that the wise women would be able to answer the question, where is the dead man now? For no one could say for sure what happened after death. Only one thing was certain. Not everyone was granted an afterlife. The Vikings believed that the souls of those who did not succeed in entering the other world haunted the earth to terrorize the living.
Sie haben ihn zurückgebracht. Er ist tot.
Wie ist er gestorben? Im Kampf?
Ich sah nicht eine Wunde an ihm. Ich weiß es nicht. Aber ich will wissen, was jetzt mit ihm geschieht. Wohin wird er gehen?
Wir können nun mal nicht in die andere Welt sehen. Du solltest froh darüber sein. Aber du kannst etwas tun, damit der Geist deines Vaters dich nicht heimsucht.
Und was?
Wenn ihr ihn begrabt, dann sorge dafür, dass sein Kopf zwischen seine Beine gebettet wird.
Only courageous warriors found a place in the other world. They reached Valhalla. Valhalla was Odin's hall. Odin and his wife lived there and enjoyed watching contests between the fallen Vikings. In Valhalla, the warrior elite would live until the end of the world. In the daytime, they tested their strength in single combats. In the evening, they celebrated at Odin's table with mead and meat. As for those not lucky enough to die in battle, hell awaited them. It is an Old Norse word related to the English word hell, a dark place of lifeless souls. Those who could afford it gave their departed an elaborate funeral. One of the largest Viking graves is in southern Sweden. The dead man's urn is surrounded by giant rocks set up in the shape of a boat that was to take him into the afterworld. Some were buried in actual boats. The most famous boat burial site was discovered by a farmer in Norway in 1903. A year later, archaeologists uncovered the Oseberg ship. It was 22 meters long and made of oak. Behind the mast lay a burial chamber containing 2 female skeletons. Those who buried them must have been wealthy. The Oseberg ship is now in a museum in Oslo. More a yacht than a warship, it testifies to the unique shipbuilding skills of the Vikings. Among the burial objects were decorated wooden carts and sledges, everything that a Viking needed for a comfortable afterlife. The skeletons belonged to a very old woman and a young girl, probably a queen with her maid. One thing is certain, the person who had such a valuable grave must have been very influential. The Oseberg ship remains the most important find from the Viking era.
Eigentlich wissen wir über den Glauben und die Religion der Wikinger erstaunlich wenig, denn sie selbst haben nichts aufgeschrieben. Alle die Edda-Lieder und andere Texte wurden erst im Hochmittelalter aufgeschrieben. Und deswegen stammt das nicht aus der Wikingerzeit selbst. Ich habe überhaupt den Eindruck, dass diese Bande nicht sonderlich religiös war, sondern sehr tolerant, so wie die heutigen Skandinavier auch.
In the 10th century, this tolerance encouraged an intermingling of faiths.
Das wird dir helfen.
The Vikings gradually assimilated Christian concepts into their world of magic and Nordic gods. Many people took to wearing both a pagan amulet and a cross. They were happy to accept protection from both Thor and Christ. Over time, missionary monks converted more and more Vikings to Christianity.
Deutsche Bischöfe sandten schon im 9. Jahrhundert Missionare nach Skandinavien. Anfangs hatten die noch sehr wenig Erfolg. Und dass überhaupt diese Mission, die von Deutschland ausging, später auch von England ausging, dass die überhaupt Erfolg hatte, hat verschiedene Ursachen, die gar nicht so viel mit Religion zu tun haben. Zum einen, weil ganz Westeuropa schon christianisiert war und für die skandinavischen Händler es wesentlich einfacher war, mit christlichen Händlern Handel zu treiben, wenn man sich selbst zum Christentum bekannte. Und das Zweite und in meinen Augen Wichtigste ist, dass das Christentum ein Sinnangebot für das Leben nach dem Tod gab. Die Wikinger hatten nur Valhall für die Kämpfer, die mit dem Schwert in der Hand starben, aber für alle anderen versprach das Christentum ein Leben nach dem Tod im Paradies, wenn man sich auf Erden nur gut verhält. Und das Dritte war, und das ist wichtig für diese Christianisierung von oben herunter, durch die Könige, dass diese Könige in Skandinavien, diese Kleinkönige, Häuptlinge, Fürsten, sich auch als Könige von Gottes Gnaden fühlen wollten, so wie die großen Könige in England und im Frankenreich.
The new faith spread slowly, first in Denmark, then in Norway, Iceland and Sweden. The conversion was by and large peaceful. Women were particularly receptive to the new religion, since it held the promise of life after death for them as well. The churchmen from Germany and England established themselves, and as the centuries went by, pagan Scandinavia converted entirely to Christianity. The famous stave churches of Norway were among the first churches in Scandinavia. They date from the 12th and 13th centuries. This Swedish crucifix also dates from the time of conversion. But Viking mythology remains an inexhaustible source for opera and film. Often it is heavily embroidered, as with Wagner's horned or winged helmets. The Old Norse sagas helped inspire The Lord of the Rings. Asterix and Obelix encounter Vikings, even if they are called Normans. There are well-loved cartoon characters, such as Vicky the Viking. Much of what we believe about the Northmen remains speculative. But there is one thing we know for sure: they were great explorers. While some went raiding, others set out to find a new place to live, for the limited stretches of fertile land in Scandinavia could not support its growing population. Many families left to seek their fortune beyond the bounds of the known world. They embarked on long and dangerous voyages. They knew the sea as no one else did. Their heavy ships, the canals, carried them safely through stormy seas and across distant oceans. In the 9th century, Vikings from Norway sailed northwest, past the Faroe Islands, and discovered Iceland. In those days, Iceland was more temperate than it is today, and it was uninhabited. Many Vikings made their home there. How did the Vikings manage to reach an island that lay over 1,000 kilometers from Norway? Thanks to a spectacular find we now know. In the 1960s, several Viking wrecks were salvaged. They are housed today in the Danish Viking Ship Museum at Roskilde. The 1,000-year-old remains tell us a great deal about the Northmen's ingenuity at shipbuilding. Two different types of ship were discovered: the Canar, a highly stable transport and merchant vessel, and the narrow, speedy longboat, ideal for marauding. A few years ago, a team from the museum reconstructed a Canar and launched it. They wanted to find out how the boats performed at sea.
By sailing the ships themselves, we get to know how you actually used what these wrecks means. We don't know it by looking at the wrecks themselves. And simply by going in and rebuilding again and trying again, we actually get to know what it does.
Every summer, the Sea Stallion sets sail once again. The crew spend weeks on board to get a real feeling for the ship. They try out all kinds of maneuvers and are always amazed at how smoothly the ship glides through the water, even with little wind.
I have the deepest respect for the Viking skipper, which have been sailing these ships for 1,000 years ago. Especially this thing that is a very simple construction of the sail, but at the same time, it's just perfect in balance.
Perfect balance and speed. They are the outstanding characteristics of all Viking ships, whether raiders or merchant vessels. They are still considered the best ships of their time, and several factors went into making them the best. When building their ships, the Vikings didn't saw the logs, but split them along the grain. This made the timber strong and flexible. The mast could be put up and taken down quickly, essential when facing a bridge across a river or whenever the crew had to row. The sail could be adjusted so as to make way against the wind, and the boats had an extremely shallow draft. The Vikings always began their major expeditions in early summer, when the fjords and coasts were free of ice and snow. One of their most momentous voyages began in Iceland. It was led by the most notorious man in the country, Eric the Red. Eric was belligerent and hot-tempered. Some of his men met their deaths at his hand. Eric was outlawed several times, but when he killed 2 men in a quarrel with his neighbor, he was banished from the island. That was how Eric the Red came to blaze a trail for future explorers. Eric left Iceland with a few men and some slaves. He wanted to scout out a land that was supposed to lie somewhere to the northwest. He found it and later called it Greenland. By calling it Greenland, Eric was hoping to lure other settlers. His plan worked, and many Vikings followed him to a new home. Eric's eldest son was called Leif, a happy boy, it was said, who, even as a child, dreamt of going out into the wide world. He was fascinated by a story that did the rounds in his father's house. It was said that an Icelandic merchant had drifted off course on his way to Greenland and had ended up in a country much further to the west. Exploration was in his family's blood. Leif was seized by a hunger for adventure, but it was years before he was able to go to sea in his own ship to find the mysterious country. He navigated according to the seafaring methods of old, by the sun and by the stars, and above all, with the help of experience. Despite the danger from storms and huge waves, Leif and his crew sailed further and further into uncharted waters. Their voyage along the west coast of Greenland took 3 days. For 2 days, they struck out across open sea, then followed a coast until they finally reached Newfoundland. In the year 1001, Leif Erikson and his men set foot on new territory. Little did the young explorers realize that they had landed on the continent of North America, so making history. The new arrivals had no idea what lay in store, but what they saw seemed to them a paradise. They reported that the land was green and full of meadows in bloom. They called the fertile land Vinland.
Ob es nun Weinland oder Weideland bedeutet, das wissen wir nicht mit Sicherheit. Aber 2 Sagas berichten über Expeditionen in dieses Land, das irgendwo in Nordamerika gelegen sein muss oder an den Küsten Nordamerikas. Und die Wikinger haben um 1000 dorthin verschiedene Expeditionen unternommen, das wissen wir. Und auch noch wissenschaftliche, monastische Texte des Hochmittelalters berichten genau, wo dieses Land im Westen liegt.
It was long thought to be only a legend that the Vikings were the first Europeans to set foot on Newfoundland. But in 1960, archaeologists found the proof. They discovered clear evidence of Norse settlements. The old farms have since been reconstructed. But after a few years, the Vikings left Vinland, never to return. No one knows what made them leave, although the Vinland saga mentions clashes with natives. It was almost 500 years before another European captain dared cross the Atlantic again. In 1492, Christopher Columbus rediscovered the New World in the name of the Spanish kings. He and his men set foot on American soil more than 1,000 kilometers south of Leif Erikson's landing spot. Columbus's discovery led to the first permanent European settlers moving to North America. They were followed by hundreds of thousands of slaves shipped from Africa to labor on plantations. Together, they built the New World. But the man who really discovered America was a Viking, Leif Erikson. Many finds point to the Vikings not only traveling west, but also sailing to the east. Arabic coins found on the Swedish island of Gotland are one sign of their eastward ventures. Archaeologists have also found several thousand foreign coins in the harbors of the trading towns of Haithabu and Birka. From Scandinavia, the Vikings developed a huge trading network. They penetrated deeper and deeper into present-day Russia. Their goal was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople. Only the toughest men dared attempt this journey because it was long and strenuous. The trip often lasted for months.
Ich kann es kaum erwarten, aus dieser mückenverseuchten Einöde rauszukommen. Wenn das stimmt, was du erzählst, dann werden wir in Konstantinopel ja in Gold baden.
Ja, das hoffe ich auch. Bis jetzt haben wir ja nicht so viel gesehen. Das hier, das haben wir ja wohl auch zu Hause.
Warte doch mal ab. Ihr habt ja keine Ahnung.
Jetzt erzähl doch noch mal.
Das habt ihr noch nicht gesehen. Das ist die reichste Stadt der Welt. Die Menschen tragen nur Samt und Seide und Schmuck aus purem Gold.
Und die Frauen?
Die Frauen. Die haben schwarzes Haar. Und eine braune Haut. Die haben irgendwas in ihrem Blick, die verzaubern Männer.
Ja, und die Männer sind klein wie Zwerge und können auch nicht einmal richtig saufen.
Das interessiert mich doch überhaupt nicht. Hauptsache, die bezahlen ordentlich.
Und sag mal, kann man die auch heiraten und mitnehmen, die Frauen?
Das kommt später. Aber nun esst doch erst mal, greift zu. Und stärkt euch. Wir haben noch einen langen Weg vor uns. Also.
The leg from Russia to Constantinople was particularly arduous. Ships and their crews had to go through forests, over rapids, and across floodplains and bogs. It was a logistical nightmare. To cross the huge expanse, the Vikings sometimes transported their canals overland. They came up with a strikingly simple idea. They dragged their boats over planks laid on the ground. Viking ships had no keel, so they didn't tip over on land. But they were heavy, and it was often days before the men could put them back in the water. From Haithabu to Constantinople, it was several thousand kilometers. The men used sheer muscle power to move their ships over land. If they were lucky, local people might help by lending their draft animals. Everywhere the Vikings went, they spread fear, especially when they opened up a new line of business: the slave trade. In the Russian forests, there were neither rich monasteries nor towns worth raiding. Besides, slaves were more profitable than the skins of wild animals. Not even children were safe from the clutches of the Northmen. Locals, curious about the newcomers, were easy prey. The slave trade became the Vikings' biggest source of income. They were ruthless in hunting for people to sell in the slave markets of Constantinople. Over the centuries, thousands of people vanished into slavery. The goal of all the Scandinavian traders was Constantinople. In the Middle Ages, the metropolis was the most important point of exchange for goods from Europe and the East. After an arduous journey, the Vikings finally followed the river Dnieper into the Black Sea. Then, the goal was in sight. There were many legends about the city on the Bosphorus, where East met West, and people of different religions lived side by side.
Konstantinopel muss einen unglaublichen Eindruck auf die Nordmänner gemacht haben. Sie nannten es auch Miklagard, die Großstadt, die Metropole des Abendlandes. Und für Wikinger, die aus Städten kamen, die aus Erdwällen bestanden, aus Holzhäusern, muss eine Stadt, die steinerne Bauten hatte, mehrstöckige Bauten, gepflasterte Straßen, gemauerte Brunnen, Wasserreservoirs, Straßenbeleuchtung und die mächtigsten Stadtmauern, die es überhaupt gab in Europa, das muss einen gigantischen Eindruck gemacht haben.
The heart of the city was the Great Bazaar. Strange scents of exotic spices, soaps and perfumes filled the air. The stalls were overflowing with goods from every country under the sun. The streets were filled with a babel of different languages. The Vikings too wanted to sell their wares. They always did good business in Constantinople.
Wie geht es dir?
The Vikings' slaves and animal skins were particularly sought after. They exchanged them for spices, silk and jewelry, or for silver coins. But it was always important to bargain. Bargaining was a skill that had to be learned. Trading in Constantinople could be a tricky business.
Ja, mein Bärenfell, 380 Hermelin, 50 Zobel und diese beiden Sklaven. Was gibt es dafür?
Was sagst du?
20.
20. Na, einverstanden.
10, 20 Dirham, was heißt das schon? Zahlen sind mir egal. Er soll die Münzen auf die Waage legen, dann sehen wir, wie viel Silber wir bekommen. Du hier abwiegen.
Wir zahlen hier in Münzen, nicht nach Gewicht. Hm? Pass auf, Yusuf. Sagen wir 30.
20.
Ihr habt einen langen Weg gehabt. 25. Ach komm, der alten Freundschaft wegen. 25? Hm? Shukran, Habibi. Justo, du bist ein guter Geschäftsmann. Vielen Dank. Na?
In their constant journey back and forth, the Northmen left their mark on Eastern Europe. Over the centuries, Swedish Vikings founded or conquered many towns in what is now Russia. They were nearly always important trading places, such as Novgorod or Kiev. The invaders from the north were called Rus. Rus was also the name of the first Russian state. It was founded in the 9th century by a Viking prince, Aljek. But Russia is not the only country with Viking roots. Normandy also has Norse origins. In the 10th century, the Northmen made so many incursions into the lower Seine that the territory was finally ceded to them. As Normans, they quickly established themselves as a regional power. From the 11th century on, Norman mercenaries migrated to southern Italy and took power there. After conquering Sicily, they converted the former emir's palace in Palermo into their seat of government. In Apulia, they left a legacy of countless Norman buildings. Even the Emperor Frederick II, builder of the Castel del Monte, had Viking blood in his veins. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy invaded England and was crowned king. He too was a descendant of the Vikings.
Die Wikinger haben uns ein neues, größeres Europa hinterlassen. Sie haben Städte gegründet, punktuell, also wie in Dublin und in York und in Kiew. Sie haben auch Staaten gegründet, nicht nur die Normandie und Russland, das von den Rus seinen Namen hat, oder natürlich auch das normannische Reich, das mittelalterliche normannische Reich in Süditalien, sondern sie haben auch neue Länder besiedelt, wie Island oder Grönland. Das heißt, sie haben den Horizont Europas nach außen verschoben und haben uns ein weiteres, ein größeres Europa hinterlassen.
As settlers, the Vikings colonized Iceland and Greenland. As explorers, they traveled to America. Their descendants ruled in Normandy, England, southern Italy, and Russia. They entered the world stage as raiders, plundering and murdering. But they had a peaceful side. They spent a large part of their time looking after their farms and homes. In a very short time, the wild Scandinavians became global players. As merchants, they opened up important trade routes that led not only to southern Europe, but also deep into Eastern Europe and even to the Orient. And in their quest for new land, the Vikings were the first to discover North America. By the height of the Middle Ages, we hear no more of the Northmen. It's as if they had disappeared.
The Vikings make a very sudden, a very dramatic entrance into the historical record. In the end, they seem to fade away, but their expansion overseas forced them to adapt, to fit in with the other cultures they encountered, until eventually they stop being pagan Scandinavians and become medieval Europeans. Around the year 1000, they established the three great kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, later Sweden, which still exist today on a par with Britain and France. The Vikings don't disappear, they merge into world history.
The Viking legacy to Europe lies in the cities and countries that they founded or conquered. At the same time, their raids on France, on England, will always be remembered with a shudder. But wherever they settled, the seafarers merged into the local population. As Vikings, they existed for only about 200 years. Since the Middle Ages, they have lived on as the familiar Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, and Icelanders, the custodians of the fantastic stories and sagas about the warriors, traders, and explorers who terrified half of Europe.
That was the final in the series. Tune in next week for more Lost Worlds, and stay tuned now for Gough Whitlam in his own words.